10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I was in a Chicago airport and I had been delayed. And I think my flight had been canceled maybe several times. I was exhausted. And I was walking to some new gate that they had just announced. And I caught the eye of an older woman, an older white woman whose name I learned later was Liz. And we both smiled at each other and decided to sit down together. She said, "You look tired." And I said something like, "You look energetic." But I think what I meant was like, "You've got that spark." She was a sparkly, sparkly woman. And as we sat there and waited for our delayed flights, it was Chicago in January. You all have a sense of what that might mean if you've looked at the weather at all anywhere around the country this week. And we had some time together. And she told me that when she was in high school in World War II was happening, and she said that a lot of girls took civil service exams and then moved to DC to work for the government to serve their country at that time. And she was one of those women. And she shared an apartment with a one bedroom apartment with five other young women at the time. She said that they had a double bed and a couch and cushions on the floor, and they just sort of slept in shifts depending on when they were working and when they were awake. After that, she traveled across North America, taking about 6 months to get all the way to San Francisco, visiting friends and trying new jobs and learning about new places. And when she and her friend got to San Francisco, they couldn't find a good place to go dancing. So they decided to sign up to become dance teachers just so that they could have some place that they could go dancing together. She told me stories about her family and her children, her grandchildren, her great grandson of 16 months old, who she was on her way to visit. She told me stories about growing up in Vermont and going out into the woods to cut down their own Christmas tree. She told me stories about how much she loved traveling as part of a military family. Her husband was in the military when she eventually married. She told me about how much she loves people. And now, or then, 10 years ago, she was the oldest in her family. She was 85 years old at that time. Her husband had died 4 years earlier. And she said that it was hard to not have anyone else to reminisce with anymore. And eventually her eyes sort of got distant. The sparkle disappeared for a moment. And she said, "I guess I'll just have to reminisce on my own." I was maybe, I'm 55 years younger than her. I don't know that experience that many of you know about feeling like there's no one to reminisce with anymore. But I got it in some sense. I got that sense of grief that she felt when you can't share those memories anymore with the people who built them with you. She had had a vibrant, vibrant life. She had loved lots of people and done a lot of things. But her words made me think about what I now call double death. And I can't remember where I learned this term, and it means a few different things. But the way that I'm going to be talking about it today is the the first death, which is when our bodies die, when we actually die. Double death is when the last person who remembers us dies. And there's no living person on earth anymore with an actual memory of who we are. Liz was going through the experience of realizing that she was the last one before the double death of so many people in her life who had died, and how lonely that place is. The finitude of that idea of double death, the truth of that real ending is frightening to me. I find that I'm almost afraid to even contemplate it for fear that I'll just kind of fall into the abyss of grief and depression. The world is made so much richer for each life that's here, for every story that we share, every memory we build together, for all of the diversity of connection. And yet, at some point, that ends. Those memories are gone. So, this week began Lent for many Christians around the world with Ash Wednesday. Did anyone actually celebrate Ash Wednesday? I know it was a little bit limited this year because of COVID, but I know there's a handful of us here who identify as Christian. There's a handful of us who celebrate Lent, even if we don't identify as Christian, just finding it to be a useful spiritual time in our lives. The basics for those of you who aren't super familiar with Lent or with Ash Wednesday is that the palms from the previous year's Palm Sunday in Christian churches. So Palm Sunday is the Sunday before Easter. There's a tradition of waving palms. Those are burned, and then the ashes that are created by burning those palms become the ashes that are used for next year's Ash Wednesday. And they're instituted on the forehead, usually as a cross. And often a priest or whoever's instituting them often says, "Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Ashes to ashes, dust to dust is the language we hear when we think about death in the Christian tradition very often. And I've been thinking about that idea, that ashes to ashes, dust to dust idea this year, partially because I have a baby approaching. Our kiddo is due just a little bit after Easter, so we're basically, if Lent is the period before the baby shows up, that's what we've got ahead of us. And I don't know about you, but every time I encounter a new baby, I feel like new babies are closer to that eternity place, that like eternity dust place, right? Like they show up and they're wrinkly and they have that sort of calm, wise gaze that makes you feel like they know something that you don't know. It's similar to that wrinkly wisdom and the intense calm gaze that we show if we're lucky enough to live a long life and prepare for our death as elders. So I'm thinking about ashes to ashes, so that dust to dust, that first ashes and dust that this baby is coming from, or as Kai has taken to saying, that the cheese that this baby is coming from, that I mostly have created this baby out of cheese over the past 8 months. But I also think about it as this new generation arises in my family, that my own father's double death is coming closer. And he's been dead for, I think, about 14 years-ish now. It'll be 14 years in a few weeks. My own child will never know my father. My own spouse never met my father. Most of the closest people in my life didn't know him, other than through my sharing of memories, through my family's sharing of memories of him. And it is so precious that there's just a couple people in this religious community who did know him, because we grew up in the same congregation outside of Boston. But for the most part, I do a lot of reminiscing on my own about my dad. And as a new generation arises in my family, his double death comes a little bit closer. I usually find Lent to be a comforting time. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, to me tells the story of the kind of immortality that I believe in, that individuals may die, but life, the cycle of life, continues, and that we are connected through the interdependent web of life. I find comfort in that interdependence. Instead of seeing the mournful death that many see in a time of Lent, I see the magic of life. Quote from the the blessing that Jacob read for us earlier. Did you not know what the Holy One can do with dust? Dust is incredible. In Unitarian Universalism, we have probably about as many ideas of what happens in the afterlife as we do people in this Zoom meeting or in our faith tradition as a whole. The thing that we mostly agree on is that we cannot fully know what happens after we die. And so instead, we return our focus to here. I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here, as Amelia was saying for us earlier. And yet I feel a clear sense of closeness with my loved ones who've passed on. I see my father's eyes in my own when I look in the mirror. I feel important mentors with me in their presence all the time. I feel like something about death for me means a leaving of one body and an entering of everything. So I normally find Lent kind of comforting, but when I think about double death, I sort of return to that grief place, that fear of even looking into the truth of real endings. It's hard to wrap my brain around the concept of a real ending, almost as hard as it is to wrap my brain around the concept of an actual forever. So, Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who is inspiring to many of us here, he wrote, "If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there would be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. Without trees, we cannot make paper. So the cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not there, the sheet of paper cannot be there either." And he goes on to say, if we look more deeply into the sheet of paper, just even a blank sheet of paper, we see that there is sunshine in it, because if there isn't sunshine, then the forest can't grow. If the forest can't grow, the trees won't be there. The trees are needed to create paper. And we look more deeply and we see that the logger is in this sheet of paper too, and the wheat that creates the bread for the logger, the father and the mother of the logger who cut down the tree to bring it to the mill to turn it into paper. He goes on and on to the point where he says that we see everything in this sheet of paper. We see all of the ways that we are interconnected in one sheet of paper if we take the time to look deeply and listen to the stories that are there. We we interconnect, we are interdependent with one another, is what he is saying. But then he goes on to talk about how the Buddhist scriptures say that actually, if you look at the blank sheet of paper with perfect understanding, if you look at it with perfect understanding, what you see is emptiness. Not everything, but emptiness. This is what I think it's a quote from the Heart Sutra is where he was talking about. And then he goes on to talk about what emptiness is. So he says, if I'm holding a cup of water and I ask you, is this cup empty? You would all say no, right? You can see that there's water in this cup. And so what if I pour out the water? What if I drink the water? I'm just going to drink some of it. Now, is this cup empty? And you might say, yes, the cup is empty. But empty of what? Right? The cup is empty of water now, but it's full of air. Emptiness only exists in relationship to something else. There is no true emptiness. It's empty of what? And usually, when something is empty of one thing, it is full of another. He goes on to say, what is this sheet of paper empty from then? And what he says is that it's empty from separation. You cannot separate any of what makes up this piece of paper. You can't separate the cloud or the sunshine or the logger or the wheat or the logger's father or mother or even our own perception from what is on this piece of paper. And so it is both everything. It is the interbeing of all, and it is the emptiness of true separation. We cannot be completely separate from each other ever. And so emptiness itself points to fullness, the Buddhist tradition would tell us. Emptiness itself tells the story of interconnection, because emptiness cannot exist without being empty of something and full of something else. Foreverness and truly ending, immortality and death, infinity and finitude. I can't wrap my brain around either, any of those concepts fully. But the more that I try, the more I see how close they are together. Forever isn't changelessness. Forever isn't an experience of a life that comes into being and lasts through eternity. Forever is actually taking a step back from looking at one life and seeing the cycle of life that repeats itself. Individuals come into being from ashes and die in ashes, come into being from dust and die in dust. But the cycle continues. That's what forever is. And so to cope with forever, we must let go again and again and again. And to cope with forever, we must find a way to love again and again and again, even after the pain and grief of letting go. Ending isn't just pure grief or loss. Even those double endings, even double death, is not simply an abyss that we can't look over because we might fall into depression. Because like emptiness, endings show us the richness of how closely we are interconnected. Endings point to what was there before it ended. So to cope with endings, our job is to see the cloud in the piece of paper, to look deeply into any one thing and see that there is everything. To cope with endings, we must be in touch with how interdependent we all truly are. And maybe the third thing that is hard to cope with is simply the unknowing. We don't know what will happen after this one life that we each get to live. We don't know what will happen after this planet will probably someday end. Way, way after any of our lifetimes, I hope. And we may have many ideas. We might have thousands of ideas about what happens, but what is true is that we are all sort of in a place of unknowing. And so to cope with unknowing, our job is simply to be present to the now, be present to this life, be present and choose to live our lives while we're here. We won't breathe the bracing air when we're gone. We can't even worry about our cares when we're gone. We won't be asked to do our share when we're gone. My friends, I hope each of us chooses to do it while we're here. May it be so, and amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abbey Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abbey just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.